Most people who have the sudden experience can't sustain it. So I think it's better to support sudden awakening with gradual awakening, which would be consistent practice and study and introspection and spiritual work. We can learn how to drive the car manually. When it starts moving automatically, then we let go of the wheel. Because there's two approaches. One is spontaneous consciousness, the awakening to spontaneous flow of consciousness. One's the manual manipulation of consciousness. We want to get good at both, which means we're prepared to make effort when effort is necessary. We're prepared to let go unconditionally when that's what's called for. So some people are very rigid on either side. So my guru was Punjaji, and he was the sudden awakening guy. And from his perspective, sudden awakening and spontaneous enlightenment is the highest truth, is the only truth, and anything else is fake, wasn't the real thing. And we can have some hardcore Zen practitioners who feel unless you practice hard work and self-discipline and rigorous practice, it's not the real thing. So I think everybody's right. A complete path, in my opinion, would contain both, because then we're ready for whatever happens. We're ready to let go if that's what's necessary. We're ready to do the hard work if that's what's called for. Makes sense. We've got all our bases covered. Because if we're going to sustain the state of enlightened awareness, we're going to have to be willing to give everything to succeed. So we have to be very big-hearted and big-minded about how it's all going to unfold and ready for anything. I believe if we're convinced that we want to do this, and we're convinced we're going to succeed, then nobody can stop us, including life circumstances. But if we have too many preferences, which is not a new idea, we're never going to make it. There are a lot of people in Tiru with my guru who had very powerful, spontaneous, higher state experiences in his presence that were really profoundly transformative for them temporarily. And it lasted for a while, but then they kind of fell out of heaven. They fell out of that state. And a lot of them don't know what to do with themselves. What do I do now that I've seen, now that I had the awakening experience in such a profound way that I'm convinced it's the most real and beautiful thing that's ever happened to me. But I've lost touch with it. What do I do now? Punjaji's gone. So many of them remain kind of lost, and lost in the desert, which is sad and painful. So Punjaji was the best at what he did. He was the best sudden awakening teacher I've ever seen. Not that I've seen everybody, but I've never heard of anybody more radical and outrageous than he was. Very few people can sustain that kind of absolute position for very long. So I'm a firm believer that it's up to us. And I believe that the foundation of the spiritual life lived in earnest is the cultivation of the unconditional, absolute, irrevocable intention to be unconditionally liberated in this life no matter what. And if we can cultivate that absolute intention and are willing to back it up with action, we're going to succeed. As I said before, nobody will be able to stop us. But I think the notion of what we're calling absolute liberation is kind of a little bit dangerous way to speak. Because what is absolute liberation anyway? Either there's a profound degree of liberation that's more or less constant, or there isn't. But as long as we're functioning through a body, mind, and personality that is manifest and subject to changing conditions, the idea of absolute liberation is a little bit hard to see what that would actually mean. So one of the things I like to say is that the experience of unconditioned consciousness is the experience of unconditional liberation, because the nature of consciousness is liberation. So the nature of consciousness itself is perfect. It's an experience. But we can never be that perfection. So we can experience perfection, but we can never be it. So the nature of consciousness as it always already is perfect and unconditionally liberated, as you say. That's the nature of consciousness as it is. But it's impossible for us to be perfect expressions of perfect liberation because our body, minds, and personalities are works in progress and are far from perfect. So what ends up happening is the result is some combination of the relationship between absolute consciousness and its expression of perfection, liberation, and the imperfection of our body, minds, and personalities. How that all looks when it goes together. So some people look great, and they look great consistently over long periods of time. Some people look great for a few weeks, and then they crash and burn. But what happened? Well, it was all going great, and I don't know what happened. I slipped and fell. So we have to be careful, I think, with this notion of unconditional liberation or perfect liberation or fully liberated. It's a dubious concept. To me, it's a mythic idea that's been outdated. Because a profound state of enlightened awareness can be comparable to another state of enlightened awareness in another person. So we can be more or less enlightened, which means we can be more enlightened or less enlightened than someone else. But to be perfectly liberated, as long as we're engaged with this body, mind, and personality, it's kind of a dubious concept. It doesn't really make sense to me. So how well can we do in the context of this body, mind, and personality that is inherently imperfect? It's a vehicle, and it's a work in progress. Hopefully it's an evolving work in progress. It's developing and becoming more conscious and more self-aware and more in control of itself if we're doing our practice well. But it's always going to be a relative attainment in that case. Consciousness itself is not relative, but the nature of the attainment of liberation is always going to be in relationship to the body, mind, and personality, no? So I know there's the Buddhist concept of reaching the yonder shore. I've arrived on the yonder shore, never to return again to samsara. So that's the idea of a kind of a final attainment of a Buddha or Arhat. And with Yoga and Vedanta, there's the idea of the Jivan Mukta. So these are all notions of what it means to have arrived. So I think of the idea of having arrived. If we would reach what we could speculatively call 51% on the other side, I'm 51% identified with my true nature, with my true self, with my authentic self, with the God impulse in myself. More than 51%, and not less than 51% is enough to be on the other side and to realize some degree of stabilization on the other side. A lot of people have glimpses, temporary glimpses. So they're nowhere near 50%. They're usually around 20%, 25%, 30%. Which means there's a powerful degree of spiritual self-confidence because of the kinds of experiences they've had. So they believe in God. They realize they've got their own God nature, but they're not necessarily stabilized on the other side of 51%. So I think the stabilization begins to become a remote possibility when we cross the 51% mark. Then we want to build on that and go to 60, 65, 70%. I think it's more reasonable, more realistic. Because if I say anybody who really wants to can get to 51%, that's reasonable. Is there anybody who really wants to can get to 100%? Very unlikely. I don't know if 100% actually ever existed in any body, mind, and personality. So we're working with odds here. Then we get to see how well do we do. How well did I do today? How well did I do yesterday? How well did I do last year? How well did I do 10 years ago? How well did I do in my last lifetime? So it's a developmental process of becoming more capable and more conscious and more enlightened, hopefully. It's a new way to think about all this. It's more taking evolutionary principles in mind and applying them to the context of moksha and enlightenment. We want to be as reasonable as possible while striving for the highest at the same time. That's my approach. Because if we're very idealistic and we're reaching very high, we'll be really testing our limits, testing our capacity, our spiritual capacities, reaching for the stars. If we don't reach for the stars, we'll never get to 51% anyway. So we want to reach as high as we can, be very reasonable about what we're trying to do, and finally, we want to make sure that we succeed. That's important. Well, the way I make decisions is through this first principle of the teaching, which is clarity of intention. I want to be free more than anything else. Enlightenment comes first. I won't let anything interfere with that. So then all the relevant questions in my personal life come up as always in relation to that equation. Do you want to go to point A or point B? Will that take me closer to my own liberation or bring me farther away? Do I want to make this choice or that choice? Will it take me closer or farther away? So you need to become a fanatic, I believe, to succeed, to stay on track. One-pointed fanatic, obsessed. In other words, if you become a musician who's obsessed with becoming a great musician, you practice 10 hours a day, people think that's wonderful. But if you become obsessed with enlightenment or meditating 10 hours a day or going to see all these gurus for help, people think he's lost it. Because people don't take consciousness seriously, or its promises, all the promises, evolutionary promises are inherent in consciousness. But we need to become a one-pointed fanatic, and then the decisions you make will all be supporting your primary choice, primary direction. So the ego is always seeking what's going to be more pleasant for me. If you want to be free, it's got nothing to do with what makes things more pleasant. In other words, what makes things more real, more absolute, more unconditionally real. And who's ready for a life like that? Very few people. I want to feel more comfortable. I don't want to be free. I want to feel a little bit more comfortable. That's not freedom. That's a life of fear. As human beings, as fully embodied human beings, we're subject to certain kinds of cravings and desires, and you get hungry and thirsty, you need to sleep, you crave for human contact. And so these kind of naturally arising biological, psychological needs are not inherently any expression of any lack of liberation. So when we hear some of these more extreme versions of no craving, no desire, it doesn't sound human anymore. It sounds like some kind of strange, cut-off state. When it becomes impervious to life and to light. So to me, it doesn't really make sense. It's too extreme. And I think human beings have done a lot of damage to themselves trying to experience a kind of a state of desirelessness. Now, the thing is, the state of samadhi itself, the state of transcendental awareness, makes us feel so happy and so full that we stop desiring other things except to be in that state. So that, to me, would be a positive expression of the desirelessness. What's the most meaningful picture of liberation that includes the fullness of our evolving humanity, that doesn't exclude it, but it fully embraces it? It doesn't try to erase it. Doesn't feel it's wrong to be human, wrong to have certain kinds of feelings and natural desires and yearnings. So we have to figure that out. I'm sure if we had a reasonable conversation, we could probably come to some pretty good conclusions. It's when we're out of balance, when the system's out of balance and out of integrity, that certain cravings become too extreme. And we get into these distorted, unwholesome, addictive states in consciousness which we hurt ourselves and hurt other people, or not in a state of balance or integrity in body, mind, and soul. So what's the most balanced relationship between being and becoming, between the inherent freedom of these higher states and our striving to become a more integrated human being? That makes more sense. But I think the idea of being a disembodied consciousness, it's free from any kind of bodily sensations or psychological or emotional preferences, is insane. And from my way of thinking, it's a pre-modern, idealistic picture of a time in human history when people were having a lot of trouble accepting their biological experience and felt that sex was something dirty and something very destructive. But it doesn't make any sense anymore. It's a crazy kind of patriarchal extremism, which is very anti-life and dangerous. So what it would look like, what I'm advocating would be profound balance and integration as a natural state in comparison to most people. a state of profound integration and wholeness, stable state of happiness and well-being, a reasonable degree of self-control and clarity of mind, and a very positive self-regard. That makes sense? So the new ideal, therefore, should be integration and wholeness, sanity, in a context that's very life-affirming. A lot of the traditional ideas about enlightenment, I feel, are historically outdated. So now is a time in history where that's very much about embracing our humanity, not resisting it, but what does it mean to fully embrace it in the context of conscious liberation? It's a very profound question. Nobody knows the full answer to that question, but that's what's on the table. So one extreme that a lot of people go to is in the effort to become more fully embodied, is an over-identification with our emotional and psychological states of consciousness, with our feelings and our woundedness and all this kind of thing. Making too big a deal out of it. So how can we embrace the challenge of being an awakened human being with all the inherent complexity involved with that? And not get trapped in the complexity, but be an expression of wholeness and sanity and integration in spite of all the complexity that we all are. Become trustworthy and beautiful. This is a beautiful human being. They must be enlightened. They're so beautiful. I want to be around them because of the fullness and the integrity of their nature.